Hello, Jakarta and the world. I'm Doug Johnson, and this is White Trash Talking. Okay, about a year ago, I began hearing a new phrase or terminology coming out of Washington that I hadn't heard before, the phrase rules-based international order. Now, this has been around for a while. Some of you may have already heard this and understand it, but it was new to me. And there was some chatter about it at the time that I heard it in alternative media, and today I want to look more closely at that phrase. I also want to look at the extent to which the U.S. is intervening militarily around the world and how this is connected to the idea of the rules-based order. Okay, and to illustrate that, I'm going to play a clip of a short speech by Anthony Blinken, and I have trouble listening to this guy, so I apologize in advance. Okay, so here it is.
The common denominator across these efforts is the simple fact that none of us can meet these challenges alone. We have to face them together. That's why we put diplomacy back at the center of American foreign policy, to help us realize the future that Americans and people around the world seek, one where technology is used to lift people up, not suppress them, where trade and commerce support workers, raise incomes, create opportunity, where universal human rights are respected, countries are secure from coercion and aggression.
Okay, I have to stop and comment. He's speaking of a world that currently the U.S. is not helping to create. He's talking about lifting people up, and he speaks of creating a world in which countries are secure from coercion and aggression. Yet the U.S. is helping to commit genocide in in Gaza, and has already slaughtered over 200,000 women and children by some estimates. The U.S. is also using Ukraine as a battering ram against Russia, which has killed over 600,000 Ukrainian soldiers and destroyed the country. While at the same time, the U.S. is allied with ISIS in Syria to destroy that country. Okay, I could go on, but I'm going to let Anthony Blinken continue.
And people, ideas, goods, and capital move freely, and where nations can both forge their own paths and work together effectively in common cause. To build that future, we must defend and reform the rules-based international order, the system of laws, agreements, principles, and institutions that the world came together to build after 2 world wars, to manage relations between states, to prevent conflict, to uphold the rights of all people. Its founding documents include the UN Charter and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which enshrine concepts like self-determination, sovereignty, the peaceful settlement of disputes.
Okay, he says here that to build the future that he was talking about, we must defend and reform the rules-based international order. Does he mean international law? He seems to imply that a rules-based order is synonymous with international law by referring to founding documents such as the UN Charter and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So why does he use this new terminology, rules-based order, instead of just saying international law? Okay, so his speech goes on, so let's continue listening.
We want not just to sustain the international order that made so much of that progress possible, but to modernize it. But that outcome is not guaranteed, because the foundations of the international order are under serious and sustained challenge. We will remain focused on the most serious long-term challenge to the international order, and that's posed by the People's Republic of China. China is the only country with both the intent to reshape the international order and, increasingly, the economic, diplomatic, military, and technological power to do it. We are not looking for conflict or a new Cold War. To the contrary, we're determined to avoid both. China's transformation is due to the talent, the ingenuity, the hard work of the Chinese people. It was also made possible by the stability and opportunity that the international order provides. We cannot rely on Beijing to change its trajectory. So, we will shape the strategic environment around Beijing to advance our vision for an open, inclusive international system.
Okay, Blinken doesn't say that China is violating international law. Instead, he says that China is challenging the rules-based order by means of its economic, diplomatic, military, and technological power. The rules-based order seems to be the U.S. order of global hegemonic dominance, and China's crime here is that it is now a peer rival to the U.S., and it has created a multipolar world. Beijing, Blinken says, will not change its trajectory, so the U.S. must shape the strategic environment around Beijing, meaning we'll change it for them. That's what that means. Blinken says we're not looking for conflict, yet this veiled threat against China seems to indicate otherwise. Now I want to look at an editorial from an international journal regarding the conflation of the two terms rules-based order and international law. This is from the Leiden University, Leiden Law School from the Netherlands, and it's entitled "The Choice Before Us, International Law or a Rules-Based International Order." And it's somewhat of a long article, and I'll just point out some key phrases, key paragraphs. So it asks, what is this creature, the rules-based international order, that American political leaders have increasingly invoked since the end of the Cold War instead of international law? Is it a harmless synonym for international law, as suggested by European leaders? Or is it something else, a system meant to replace international law, which has governed the behavior of states for over 500 years? It's a good question. So scroll down. Okay. The rules-based international order may be seen as the United States' alternative to international law, an order that encapsulates international law as interpreted by the United States to accord with its national interest. A chimera, meaning whatever the U.S. and its followers want it to mean at any given time. Premised on the United States' own willingness to ignore, evade, or rewrite the rules whenever they seem inconvenient, the RBO is seen to be broad, open to political manipulation, and double standard. Okay, I'm going to go down to the end of this article. Here it says, the RBO is something other than international law. It is an alternative regime outside the discipline of international law, which inevitably challenges and threatens international law. Unlike international law, it does not seem to be universal order. Instead, it is an order employed by the West, again, particularly the United States, to ensure its dominance. The U.S. seems increasingly desperate to ensure its position of dominance in the world. I think this is one strategy to help secure that. I don't think it will work. Listening to Anthony Blinken talk the way he was about China and thinking that people can't see through his mannerisms, it's very troubling. Okay, now I want to look at a study done by Fletcher Center for Strategic Studies. This is from Tufts University. It's MIP Research Military Intervention Project. What they do is they track the extent and the frequency over time of military interventions. And I just want to read a couple of excerpts. According to our data, the U.S. has undertaken over 500 international military interventions since 1776, with nearly 60% undertaken between 1950 and 2017. What's more, over 1/3 of these missions occurred after 1999. So clearly there's been an increase in frequency. It continues. As traditional diplomacy withers away, growing in its place are shadowy special operation missions, drone strikes, and/or readily utilized conventional military deployments. As of this year, while U.S. ambassadors are operating in 1/3 of the world's countries, U.S. special military operators are active in 3/4. And this is consistent with what I've been hearing. You take Russia, for example. The ambassador to Russia was recalled because no one was talking to him. He just sat there in Washington. The U.S. is not engaging in diplomacy with their rivals, their enemies, and it's very dangerous. It could lead to escalation. Okay, so let's continue. So here's a chart by MIP Fletcher, and it shows the increased frequency and interventions by era and region. And you can see there's been an increased frequency in sub-Saharan Africa as well as the Middle East since 1990. Here's another showing this strong cluster of interventions as we move more and more to the present. Okay, so that's by Fletcher, but I wanted to corroborate that. And so what I've done is I looked at a research by Congress, that Congress did, to make sure that the numbers were somewhat accurate. And so I want to put that up now. Okay, this is from a website, the Congressional Research Service, and it's entitled The Instances of Use of United States Armed Forces Abroad, 1798 to 2022. And I'm not going to spend much time on this. I just want to show you the extent of their study. And here there's 50 pages documenting U.S. military interventions overseas. Each line indicates a new intervention, and I'm going to scroll through these very quickly. It's very extensive, over 50 pages. And you see, when you get to the present, it's closer to the present, let's say here 1999, you can see that there's a lot of activity in 1999. And 2000, a lot of activity. So there's an increase in activity currently. Okay, so that's a congressional study. I wanted to show that to corroborate the MIP that I was showing, to just show it's not skewed or inaccurate. All right, so now I want to look at U.S. compliance with international law. And this is from another journal, a legal journal, IADL, the International Association of Democratic Lawyers. And it's entitled Serial U.S. Violations of the UN Charter by Marjorie Cohen. And she writes, in 1945, the United Nations Charter was created to save the succeeding generations from the scourge of war. The League of Nations, which the United States refused to join, had failed to prevent the rise of fascism and the Second World War. But 75 years after the creation of the UN Charter, armed conflict, particularly wars initiated by the United States, continues to plague the world. The Charter requires that all states settle their disputes peacefully and refrain from the use of armed force except when acting in self-defense after an armed attack by another country, or when the Security Council authorizes it. Self-defense is defined by the leading Caroline case of 1837, which says the necessity for self-defense must be instant, overwhelming, leaving no choice of means and no moment for deliberation. It's very precise in its definition of when violence, war can be used. She continues, yet the 5 most recent U.S. presidents have violated the Charter's prohibition on the use of force. In October 2001, George W. Bush invaded Afghanistan, even though Afghanistan had not attacked the United States. Bush's invasion of Afghanistan did not constitute lawful self-defense, and the Security Council never approved the use of force. All right. She continues, both of Bush's wars in Afghanistan and Iraq violated the UN Charter. It seems to be par for the course. Let's continue. Okay, she talks about the U.S.'s attitude towards the UN and by connection international law. And she says, Bolton declared, there is no United Nations. There is an international community that occasionally can be led by the only real power left in the world, and that is the United States, when it suits our interests and when we can get others to go along. Bolton added, when the United States leads, the United Nations will follow. When it suits our interests to do so, we will do so. And continues, Madeleine Albright, Clinton's Secretary of State, called the UN a tool of American foreign policy. It was Albright who oversaw the US-led NATO bombing of Yugoslavia in 1999, which also violated the UN Charter. Then Barack Obama and his counterparts in France and Britain secured a resolution from the Council that approved a no-fly zone over Libya in 2011. But the three countries engaged in forcible regime change and ousted Libyan President Muammar Gaddafi. This went beyond what was the resolution authorized. And Gaddafi was murdered in the street, and chaos has reigned throughout Libya since. Okay, she continues, on January 2nd, 2020, Trump ordered the illegal drone assassination of Iranian Major General Qasem Soleimani while he was in Iraq. Neither Iran nor Iraq had attacked the United States or a UN member, and the Council did not authorize Trump's drone attack. Article 2 of the Charter states that all members shall refrain in their international relations from the threat or use of force against the territorial integrity or political independence of any state. Trump's threat to totally destroy North Korea violated the Charter's mandate. The preemptive use of force violates the Charter. Okay, so it's becoming mainstream in the U.S. It's considered normal to threaten other countries, but we've forgotten even what international law is, and we're repeatedly violating international law, and the people are not holding the government officials to account. The people don't know themselves because it's so normalized. Okay, so the article ends with talking about George Kennan. This is at the time when the U.S. was helping to write the Geneva Convention in San Francisco. Kennan was involved. He was an architect of the U.S. containment strategy against the Soviet Union, and he made a striking admission. He said, quote, "We have 50% of the world's wealth, but only 6.3% of its population. Our real task in the coming period is to devise a pattern of relationships which will allow us to maintain this position of disparity," Kennan noted. "We should cease to talk about the raising of the living standards and democratization. The day is not far off when we are going to have to deal in straight power concepts." That day is now. The United States is dealing in straight power concepts. They're a rogue state operating outside the purview of international law. They are not abiding by international law, using the RBO as a justification for that. So I want to look at the extent to which the U.S. has gone rogue, because I don't use that term lightly. Chomsky used to talk about the U.S. as a rogue state. I miss Chomsky. Yeah, the U.S. is a rogue state, and I want to play Jeffrey Sachs, a couple of clips by him to demonstrate that. Have a listen.
And I think it is very important for everybody to understand that the U.S. has been essentially at perpetual war in the Middle East since 2001 at Israel's behest, and on a list that was already known in 2001. And I don't mean a metaphorical list, I mean a literal list. And the list was explained to the American people by General Wesley Clark, the former Supreme Commander of NATO forces.
He said, "I just got this down from upstairs," meaning the Secretary of Defense's office today, and he said, "This is a memo that describes how we're going to take out 7 countries in 5 years, starting with Iraq and then Syria, Lebanon, Libya, Somalia, Sudan, and finishing off Iran." I said, "Is it classified?" He said, "Yes, sir." I said, "Well, don't show it to me." If you were Iran, you'd probably believe that you were mostly already at war with the United States anyway, since we've asserted that their government needs regime change. So, and we've asked Congress to appropriate $75 million to do it, and we are supporting terrorist groups, apparently, who are infiltrating and blowing up things inside Iran.
Yes, and the U.S. has regime sanctions in effect for 15 years against Iran, which is crushing their economy. You remember Blinken at the beginning said he wanted to create a world in which countries are secure from coercion and aggression. And then look at what they're doing. The U.S. is doing secretly, planning to overthrow 7 countries in 5 years. Let's listen to Jeffrey Sachs. Continue.
Now, what happened? The U.S. got tied down in Iraq for several years by the insurgency, and so the 7 wars in 5 years did not pan out on the timeline. But Obama came in and he was given the instructions. Mr. President, your job is next. That's Syria. And in 2011, Obama launched CIA operations to overthrow Assad at the behest of Israel. The United States backed Ethiopia to invade Somalia. The United States backed rebels to break Sudan into pieces. And now there's wars raging with millions suffering in Sudan and in South Sudan, thanks to the handiwork of the United States. Now, in 2011, Obama sent in NATO to bomb Libya. That's another 13 years of war. And the one that Netanyahu wants, the big prize, that hasn't happened yet, but he's just trying every which way to get the United States to go to war with Iran. It's 6 out of 7 right now, and not one of those 6 is stable and peaceful.
Yes, it's the scourge of war that the Geneva Conventions was meant to eradicate. The U.S. now is the rogue state responsible for this scourge. The U.S. is operating outside of international law. Their criminal activity is destroying the world. The world needs to stop the U.S. from this. Thankfully, the U.S. empire is waning. And eventually, the U.S. will lose more and more power. Hopefully, the U.S. doesn't take the world with it as it falls. If you like what I say, please give me a like. Please subscribe. I would love to hear from you. Please comment, good or bad. I would love to hear from you. And I'll see you next week. I'm White Trash Talking. I'm Doug Johnson. Thank you. Bye.